The rifle crack echoed across the frozen wasteland like a death sentence. Nantan pressed her back against the ice-crusted boulder, blood seeping through her torn buckskin shirt where the bullet had grazed her ribs. Her breath came in ragged puffs of white vapor as she counted the hoofbeats, 6 horses, maybe 7, their riders closing in with the methodical patience of men who knew their prey was trapped. "Knock, come out, Apache bitch." The voice carried cruel satisfaction across the wind-scoured landscape. "Make this easy on yourself." She touched the knife at her belt, her grandfather's blade, the only thing she'd saved from the burning village. 23 winters she'd lived, and it would end here in this godforsaken stretch of frozen hell, hunted like a rabid wolf by men who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be eliminated. The storm had been building all morning, dark clouds pregnant with snow, that would either save her or become her frozen shroud. She could taste the metallic bite of approaching weather, feel the temperature dropping with each gust of wind that howled between the rocks like the voices of her murdered people. Another shot splintered stone inches from her head. Closer now, always closer. Nantan closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to spirits who had already abandoned her once. If death was coming, let it be quick. Let it be clean. Let it not be the slow, humiliating end these white hunters had planned for her. The hoofbeats stopped. In the sudden silence, she heard only the wind and her own thundering heartbeat. Then came the soft crunch of boots on snow, or the click of metal on metal as weapons were checked and readied. They were moving in on foot now, surrounding her position, with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. "I didn't know where to run now, squaw," called a different voice and younger eager. "Boss says we can have some fun before we finish you." Nantan's grip tightened on the knife handle. If they wanted her alive for their sport, they'd have to come within reach. And when they did, the world exploded in gunfire and screaming, but not her screaming. The sounds came from beyond the rocks, from the direction of her pursuers. Horses whinnied in terror, men shouted confused orders, and through it all came the steady, methodical crack of a rifle fired by someone who knew how to use it. When the chaos ended, 7 men lay dead in the snow, and their blood steaming in the frigid air. Standing over them was a figure that seemed carved from the harsh landscape itself. Tall, weathered with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, like a pale lightning bolt frozen in flesh. Gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The stranger's rifle remained pointed at the ground, but his hand rested easily on the grip of a Colt revolver that had clearly seen extensive use. "You hurt." His voice was rough as sandpaper aged by whiskey and disappointment. Nantan stared at him, trying to process what had just happened. A white man had killed 7 other white men to save an Apache woman he'd never seen before. It made no sense. "Why?" she managed to whisper. The stranger looked at the bodies scattered around them, then back at her with those unsettling gray eyes. "Because," he said simply, "I'm tired of watching people die when I could prevent it." Caleb Ransom had been tracking his stolen cattle for 3 days when he'd heard the gunfire. He'd crested the ridge expecting to find rustlers, or maybe Apaches raiding his herd, not a lone woman being hunted by what looked like half the territorial militia. But when he'd seen the 7 men closing in on their quarry like wolves on a wounded deer, something had snapped inside him. Maybe it was the memory of Sarah's voice telling him that mercy was what separated civilized men from beasts. Maybe it was the guilt that had been eating at him for 2 years, ever since he'd failed to save his own family from the fire that had claimed their lives. Or maybe he'd just reached the point where he couldn't stomach any more senseless killing. The Apache woman was younger than he'd first thought, early 20s, with the high cheekbones and dark eyes that spoke of pure bloodline. She was also clearly starving her buckskin clothes, hanging loose on a frame that had once been fuller. How long had she been running? How had she survived this long in country that showed no mercy to her kind? "Can you ride?" he asked, nodding toward his horse. She looked at the animal, then back at him with suspicion that ran bone deep. "You would take me with you. I would take you somewhere safe," Caleb corrected. These men had friends. When they don't come back, those friends will come looking. As if summoned by his words, the wind picked up, driving snow between them in horizontal sheets. The storm was coming fast now, and anyone caught in the open when it hit would be dead before morning. "My place is 5 miles south," he said, having to raise his voice over the wind. "It's warm, dry, and defensible. You can rest there until the weather clears." And then Caleb looked at her. This woman who should have been his enemy, who had every reason to distrust him, who was offering him nothing but trouble and complications he didn't need. 2 years ago, he would have ridden away and let her take her chances. 2 years ago, he'd been a different man. "And you decide what comes next," he said. "But first we survive the storm." Nantan stared at this scarred stranger who'd appeared from nowhere to save her life. Everything about the situation screamed trap. But what choice did she have? The dead men around them proved his willingness to kill to protect her, and the approaching blizzard would finish what the bounty hunters had started if she stayed exposed. "I am called Nantan," she said, accepting his offered hand up behind him on the horse. "Caleb," he replied, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. "And if you feel yourself slipping, say something. I've already lost too many people to carelessness." They rode into the teeth of the storm, leaving the dead behind for the scavengers. The Ransom ranch sat in a protected valley surrounded by cottonwoods that his father had planted 30 years ago. The house was solid timber and stone built to last through whatever the territory could throw at it. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth that Nantan hadn't felt in weeks. Caleb helped her down from the horse, noting how she swayed on her feet, despite her efforts to appear strong. When had she last eaten? When had she last slept somewhere warm and safe? Inside, the house was sparse but comfortable, with the kind of furniture that spoke of people who'd built something meant to last. But there were gaps, empty spaces where photographs had been removed, a woman's rocking chair pushed into a corner and covered with dust, children's toys hastily stored in wooden crates. Nantan noticed everything with the sharp awareness that had kept her alive through months of running. This man had suffered losses that cut deep wounds that hadn't healed despite the passage of time. "Sit," Caleb ordered, guiding her to a chair near the fireplace. "I'll get the fire going and find you something to eat." She wanted to refuse his charity to maintain the pride that was all she had left, but her body betrayed her, collapsing into the chair with the exhaustion that went beyond the physical. When had she last felt safe enough to simply sit without watching every shadow for enemies? Caleb moved with efficient purpose, building up the fire and heating water for coffee. His hands were steady, competent, scarred by years of hard work. Everything about him spoke of a man who knew violence intimately, but had grown weary of it. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked without turning around. 4 days, maybe 5. The admission came easier than expected. "There was a farmhouse where I found some corn, but the family returned before I could take much." "And before that?" Nantan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the growing flames. "My people scattered after the raid on our winter camp. I've been alone since then." "How long ago was the raid?" 3 moons. She paused, then added quietly, "My husband was killed in the first attack. He died protecting children who weren't even his own." Caleb's hands stilled on the coffee pot. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of understanding that surprised her. "I lost my wife and daughter 2 winters ago. House fire while I was away on business." He turned to face her, and she saw her own pain reflected in his gray eyes. "Some of the townspeople think I said it myself." "Did you?" "No, but I might as well have." He poured coffee into 2 cups, his movements careful and deliberate. "I was supposed to be home that night. If I had been, they might still be alive." The simple honesty of his words cut through her defenses like a blade. This wasn't the casual cruelty she'd learned to expect from white men or the righteous hatred that had driven her pursuers. This was raw grief, as fresh and painful as her own. "What was her name?" Nantan asked. "Your wife." Sarah. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison before she married me. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. She had red hair and a temper to match. Used to say I was the most stubborn man in 3 territories, but she married me anyway. And your daughter, Emma. She was 6. His voice broke slightly. Loved horses, wanted to learn to rope cattle like her old man. She'd follow me around the ranch, chattering about everything and nothing, bright as a new penny. They sat in comfortable silence after that, sharing coffee and the warmth of the fire, while the storm raged outside. Nantan found herself studying his face, noting the lines of grief etched around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried invisible weight. "Why did you save me?" she asked finally. Caleb was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did speak, his words came slowly, as if he was working through the reasoning himself. Sarah used to feed anyone who showed up at our door. Didn't matter their color or circumstances. She said hunger and cold were enemies of all humanity. He stared into his coffee cup. I suppose I'm trying to honor her memory. Or maybe I just can't stomach watching another innocent person die when I have the power to prevent it. You don't know that I'm innocent. No, he agreed. But I know those men weren't interested in taking you alive for trial. They were hunting you for sport, and that's something I can't abide. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and reminding them both that the storm was far from over. Nantan pulled the blanket he'd given her tighter around her shoulders, feeling truly warm for the first time in months. I should leave when the weather clears, she said, though the thought of returning to the frozen wilderness made her stomach clench with dread. Where would you go? Caleb asked reasonably. Your people are scattered, winter's just beginning, and there are bounty hunters throughout the territory looking for Apache refugees. You wouldn't last a week. He was right, and they both knew it. But the alternative, staying here depending on his kindness while putting him at risk, seemed equally impossible. The people of your town will not tolerate my presence, she pointed out. The people of my town barely tolerate my presence, Caleb replied with dark humor. Besides, they don't need to know you're here. This place is isolated enough that visitors are rare, especially in winter. And when spring comes? Caleb looked out at the storm, his expression thoughtful. We'll figure that out when the time comes. For now, you need rest and regular food. This place has both. Despite every instinct screaming at her to run, to trust no one, to rely only on herself, Nantan found herself nodding. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the bone-deep weariness that came from running for so long with nowhere to go. I will earn my keep, she said firmly. I can cook, tend animals, mend clothes. I won't be a burden. Right now, your only job is to get your strength back, Caleb said. After that, we can talk about chores. As he showed her to the small upstairs room that would be hers, Nantan caught sight of a family portrait on the hallway wall. Caleb, with his arm around a beautiful red-headed woman, a laughing child on his shoulders. The happiness in their faces was almost painful to see, knowing how their story had ended. They were beautiful, she said softly. Caleb paused in the doorway, following her gaze to the photograph. They were everything good in this world, he said quietly. And they deserved better than the man who failed to protect them. After he left her alone, Nantan sat on the edge of the narrow bed and tried to process the sudden change in her circumstances. This morning, she'd been a hunted animal with death closing in from all sides. Tonight, she was safe, warm, and fed, protected by a man who had every reason to see her as his enemy. It was too good to be true, which meant it probably was. Experience had taught her that kindness from white men always came with a price, always hid some darker purpose. But as she listened to Caleb moving around downstairs, banking the fire and securing the house for the night, she heard nothing but the careful routines of a man trying to create order in a disordered world. Maybe she could trust him, at least until the storm passed. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the house. But for the first time in months, Nantan fell asleep without fear. She woke to the smell of bacon and the blessed absence of immediate danger. Sunlight streamed through the small window, revealing a world transformed by snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind drifts that reached nearly to the windowsill. Downstairs, Caleb was at the stove, stirring something in a cast-iron pan. He looked up when she appeared, noting how she moved, still cautious, still ready to fight or flee, but with less of the desperate wariness that had marked her arrival. "Our coffee's hot," he said, nodding toward the pot. "And there's bacon, eggs, and biscuits if you're hungry." The food was simple, but perfectly prepared, and the kind of solid fare that spoke of a man who'd learned to take care of himself. Nantan ate slowly, savoring each bite while trying not to appear too eager. Pride was sometimes all that stood between survival and surrender. Storms passed. Caleb observed, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "But there'll be more. Weather's been strange this winter." "How long?" she asked. "How long what?" "Auf our star." "How long can I stay before it becomes impossible to hide my presence?" Caleb considered the question seriously. "Depends on how careful we are. This place is far enough from town that unexpected visitors are rare. As long as you stay out of sight when anyone comes calling, we might manage it through the winter. And then we figure out what comes next." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was more hope than she'd had in months. Nantan found herself relaxing slightly, allowing herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. "Tell me about your town," she said. "What kind of people live there?" Caleb's expression darkened. "The usual mix. Some good folks trying to build something decent, some who came west to escape their past, and some who brought their worst impulses with them." He paused. "There's been talk lately about the Apache problem, as they call it. Demands for action for cleaning out any remaining bands in the territory. Led by whom? Deputy Virgil Slade, mostly. He's got a talent for stirring up trouble and a personal grudge against me." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Slade was married to my wife's cousin. He's always blamed me for not being here when the fire started." "Does he have evidence of wrongdoing?" "He has suspicions, and the kind of mean spirit that turns suspicions into certainties." Caleb met her eyes directly. "You should know that harboring you puts me at risk. If Slade finds out you're here, he'll use it to destroy what's left of my reputation." "Then I should leave," Nantan said, starting to rise from her chair. "Sit down." Caleb ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I told you we'd figure this out together, and I meant it. I'm not letting you walk back into that frozen hell just because Virgil Slade might cause me trouble." The conviction in his voice surprised her. Most men would have reconsidered their charity once the costs became clear. But there was something in Caleb's eyes that spoke of deeper motivations, wounds that mirrored her own. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered prairie. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was revealing secrets he'd never shared before. "Because I've spent 2 years drowning in guilt and self-pity, and I'm tired of being that man," he said finally. "Because Sarah would have taken you in without a second thought, and maybe if I can honor that part of her memory, I can find some peace with the rest. And if you can't, if helping me only brings you more pain, then at least I'll have tried to do something right for once." The simple honesty of his answer cut through the last of her defenses. This wasn't charity or pity or some elaborate scheme. This was a broken man trying to find redemption through an act of mercy, just as she was a broken woman trying to find reasons to keep living. Maybe they could heal each other. Maybe they could find some measure of peace in a world that seemed determined to destroy anything beautiful or hopeful. Or maybe they were both fools destined for disappointment and death. Either way, she was tired of running. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "For now." The relief in his eyes was unmistakable. though he tried to hide it behind stoic practicality. "Good," he said. "Then let's get you some proper clothes and figure out how to make this work." For 2 weeks, they established a routine that felt almost normal. Nantan helped with cooking and mending while avoiding the windows whenever riders passed on the distant road. Caleb tended his remaining cattle and made trips to town for supplies, always careful to buy only what he would normally purchase for a single man living alone. She was stronger now, the regular meals and warm shelter working their healing magic on her body. But the real change was subtler, the gradual relaxation of muscles that had been tensed for months, the return of curiosity about the world beyond mere survival. The slow rebuilding of trust that she'd thought lost forever. Caleb, too, seemed to be changing. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum to dead dreams. There was laughter again, conversation, and the simple pleasure of sharing meals with someone who understood loss without needing it explained. But their fragile peace couldn't last forever. The trouble started with small things, supplies disappearing from his barn, cattle found dead in distant pastures, gates left open so his horses could wander. Someone was testing him, probing for weaknesses, building toward something larger. "It's Slade," Caleb said after finding 3 more head of cattle shot for no apparent reason. "He's trying to goad me into doing something stupid. Or he suspects I'm here and is trying to force me into the open," Nantan pointed out. The truth was probably both. Slade had always been petty and vindictive, but this campaign of harassment felt more focused, more personal than his usual bullying. The escalation came on a cold February morning, when a rock crashed through their front window, followed immediately by the sharp crack of a rifle shot that splintered the door frame inches from where Caleb was standing. "Stay down," he ordered, grabbing his rifle from its rack above the fireplace. Through the broken window, they could see 3 riders in the yard, their faces hidden behind bandanas, but their intentions clear. "Aunt Caleb Ransom." The voice belonged to Slade, though he was disguised like the others. "We know you're harboring Apache scum. Send her out and maybe we'll let you live." "Go to hell, Virgil," Caleb shouted back, taking aim through the window. "You want her, you'll have to come through me." "That can be arranged." The gunfight was brief, but vicious. Slade and his men had expected to terrorize a grieving widower into submission, not face down a veteran of the Apache wars who knew how to use cover and concealment to his advantage. When the smoke cleared, one of the riders was down, and the other 2 were in full retreat. But the message was clear: their secret was out, and the consequences were escalating. "We can't stay here," Nantan said as they examined the damage. "This will only get worse." "Where can we go?" Caleb asked. "Slade will follow wherever we run, and he'll have half the territory with him once he spreads word that I'm protecting Apache raiders." "I'm not a raider. Doesn't matter. Truth has never been Slade's strong suit." They spent the rest of the day fortifying the house and preparing for siege. Caleb had enough supplies to last several weeks, and his position was defensible if they were careful. But they both knew it was only a matter of time before Slade returned with reinforcements. That night, as they sat by the fire cleaning weapons and planning for the worst, Nantan made a confession that changed everything. "There's something you should know about me," she said quietly. "Something that might make you reconsider offering me protection." Caleb looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. "What is it?" "I wasn't just running from bounty hunters," she said. "I was running from my own people, too. There are Apaches who blame me for the massacre of our winter camp, who believe I led the soldiers to us." "Did you?" "No, but I might as well have." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been carrying them too long. "I was married to a war chief named Askuk. 3 days before the attack, we had a terrible fight about whether to move the camp to a more defensible position. He wanted to stay near the water source. I wanted to retreat deeper into the mountains." She paused, staring into the fire, as if seeing ghosts in the flames. "I said things. Cruel things. I told him he was a coward for avoiding a fight, that he cared more about comfort than the safety of our people. So he led a war party out to prove his courage to raid a settler's ranch and bring back horses and weapons. And while he was gone, the soldiers attacked. Yes, they came at dawn when our warriors were scattered and our defenses weak. The women and children fought as best they could, but... She shrugged helplessly. 17 people died that day, including children who might have lived if we'd moved the camp when I first suggested it. Caleb set down his rifle and moved to sit beside her on the couch. The revelation didn't shock him as much as she'd expected. He'd carried similar guilt for too long not to recognize its signs. "It wasn't your fault," he said quietly. "Wasn't it, if I hadn't argued with Askuk, if I hadn't wounded his pride with my words? He never would have led the war party away from camp. Our warriors would have been there to defend us. And maybe you all would have died together instead of some escaping to fight another day." Nantan looked at him with surprise. "You don't blame me. For what? For being human. For making mistakes under impossible circumstances." Caleb shook his head. "I've spent 2 years blaming myself for not being home when my family needed me. I know how that poison eats at you from the inside. Then why are you helping me? Why risk everything for someone who failed her own people?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Because guilt is a luxury we can't afford anymore," he said. "The dead don't need our self-punishment, and they need us to learn from our mistakes and do better. Your people need survivors who can carry their memory forward, not martyrs who die for their sins. And your family. My family needs me to become the kind of man they believed I was, even if I wasn't that man when they were alive." The simple truth of his words broke something open inside her chest. For months, she'd been carrying the weight of 17 deaths, 17 accusations whispered in the voices of the dead. But looking at this scarred man, who'd chosen to risk everything for her sake, she began to understand that survival itself could be a form of redemption. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we stop running from who we were and start becoming who we need to be." Outside, the wind howled through the broken window, carrying with it the promise of more storms to come. But for the first time since the massacre, Nantan felt something other than despair. She felt hope. The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn. Nantan woke to the sound of glass breaking and the acrid smell of smoke. Through the window, she could see torches moving in the darkness, at least a dozen men surrounding the house, some carrying weapons, others with cans of kerosene. "Fire," she said, shaking Caleb awake. "They're trying to burn us out." He was instantly alert, grabbing his rifle and moving to the window. The situation was worse than she'd described. Slade had brought what looked like half the town, and they were positioned to cover all possible escape routes. "Back door?" Nantan asked. "Covered." Caleb's voice was grim. "Windows, too. They've learned from last time." The smoke was getting thicker now, seeping through the floorboards from the fire they'd set beneath the house. Soon, they'd have to choose between burning alive and facing the guns waiting outside. "There's something I need to tell you," Caleb said, his voice urgent. "Something about my past that you deserve to know before we die," Nantan finished. "Before you decide whether to trust me with your life." The house shuddered as flames began eating through the support beams beneath them. Whatever he needed to say, it would have to be said quickly. "I wasn't just a rancher during the Apache wars," he said. "I was a scout for the army. I spent 2 years living with your people, learning your customs, your language, your secret places." Nantan's blood turned to ice water. "You were a scout." "I guided soldiers through Apache territory. I helped them find villages, hunting parties, anyone the army considered hostile." His voice was raw with guilt. "I told myself I was preventing larger conflicts, that cooperation was better than all-out war. But the truth was simpler. I was paid to betray your people, and I was good at it." The confession hit her like a physical blow. This man who'd saved her life, who'd offered her sanctuary, who'd become the closest thing to hope she'd known in months, he was one of them. One of the white devils who'd guided death to her people's doorstep. Whispering Springs. She whispered the name falling from her lips like a curse. Caleb's face went white. You know about Whispering Springs. My husband died there. Her voice was barely audible above the growing roar of flames. Ascook was part of the hunting party that was ambushed in that canyon. 17 warriors died because someone led the soldiers through paths that were supposed to be secret. Nantan, that was you. It wasn't a question. You guided them to my husband's death. Caleb nodded, unable to meet her eyes. I didn't know your husband personally, but yes. I was the scout who led Captain Morrison's unit through the mountain passes to intercept the hunting party. The house was filling with smoke now, the heat growing unbearable. Soon they'd be forced outside to face Slade's guns, and Nantan found herself wondering if that might be justice after all. Maybe she was meant to die here, killed by the same man who'd caused her husband's death. But as she looked at Caleb, seeing the genuine anguish in his gray eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of old sins, she realized something that surprised her. She wasn't angry. She was heartbroken. This man who'd become her salvation was also her destroyer. The person who'd shown her that redemption was possible was the same one who'd made redemption necessary. It was almost too cruel to bear. Why didn't you tell me before? She asked. Because I'm a coward, he said simply. Because I was afraid you'd leave, and I needed... He paused, struggling for words. I needed to believe that someone like you could forgive someone like me. And now we're probably going to die together, and you deserve to know the truth about the man who failed to save you. The flames were reaching the main floor, now licking at the walls with hungry orange tongues. Through the smoke, they could hear Slade shouting orders to his men, positioning them for the moment when fire forced the occupants outside. Nantan looked at the rifle in her hands, then at the man beside her, who'd been both her salvation and her doom. A choice had to be made, and it had to be made now. The root cellar, she said suddenly. What? There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen, isn't there, with an outside entrance? Caleb's eyes widened as he understood. You think we can get out that way? If they're watching the doors and windows, they might miss a cellar entrance, especially in the dark. It was their only chance. Together, they crawled through the smoke-filled kitchen to the trap door that led to the small, underground storage space. The cellar was cramped and cold, but it had been dug deep enough to store vegetables through the winter, which meant it extended beyond the house's foundation. The outside entrance was partially blocked by snow, but they managed to clear it enough to squeeze through. They emerged 50 yards from the house behind the barn, where Slade's men couldn't see them. The horses, Caleb whispered. But as they crept toward the barn, they discovered that Slade had thought of that too. 2 men stood guard outside, rifles ready, waiting for exactly this kind of escape attempt. I can take them. Nantan whispered, her knife already in her hand. No, too risky. Caleb studied their surroundings, noting the positions of Slade's men and the layout of the buildings and the direction of the wind. There's another way. He led her to the far side of the barn, where a small door opened into the grain storage area. From there, they could reach the horses without being seen, but they'd have to move fast once they mounted up. Where do we go? Nantan asked as they prepared to make their break. Caleb looked back at his burning house, at the life he'd built, and was now losing to the sins of his past. Anywhere but here, he said grimly. They burst from the barn at full gallop, scattering Slade's men and disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness before the deputy could organize pursuit. Behind them, the house that had sheltered their fragile hope collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. But they were alive, and for the moment, that was enough. They rode hard through the night, following game trails and creek beds that would hide their tracks from pursuit. By sunrise, they were deep in the Badlands, surrounded by rock formations that offered both concealment and defensive positions. They hadn't spoken since leaving the burning ranch. The revelation about Caleb's past hung between them like a sword cutting away the trust they'd so carefully built. Nantan rode behind him in silence, her mind churning with conflicting emotions she couldn't begin to sort through. He'd saved her life, but he'd also destroyed it. He'd offered her sanctuary, but he was the reason she'd needed sanctuary in the first place. How was she supposed to reconcile those contradictions? "We should rest the horses," Caleb said as they reached a sheltered canyon with water and grass. "And we need to talk." Nantan dismounted without a word, tending to her horse with the automatic efficiency of someone raised around animals. But her movements were stiff, mechanical, stripped of the easy companionship they'd developed over the past weeks. "Say something," Caleb said finally. "Yell at me, curse me, tell me what you're thinking. Anything's better than this silence." "What do you want me to say?" she asked without looking at him. "That I forgive you. That it doesn't matter, that we can go back to the way things were. I want you to tell me the truth about how you feel." Nantan finally met his eyes, and he saw something there that was worse than anger, disappointment so profound it seemed to reach her soul. "I feel like a fool," she said quietly. "I thought I'd found someone who understood me, someone who could see past the surface to who I really was. Instead, I found the man who helped murder my husband. It wasn't murder, it was war. Was it?" Her voice was sharp now, cutting. 17 unarmed hunters ambushed in a canyon while trying to bring meat back to their families. What would you call it? Caleb had no answer for that. He'd told himself the same lies for years, that it was war, that the Apache were hostiles, that he was preventing greater bloodshed by helping the army track down the raiders. But looking into Nantan's eyes, seeing the pain he'd helped cause, those comfortable justifications crumbled to dust. "You're right," he said. "It was murder, and I was part of it. At least you can admit it now. Does that help? Does my confession ease your pain or bring back your husband?" "No," she said, "but it's honest, and that's more than I had before." They made camp in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As darkness fell, they built a small fire and shared a meager meal of dried meat and hardtack. The flames danced between them like a barrier, highlighting the gulf that had opened between them. "What happens now?" Caleb asked eventually. "I don't know." Nantan stared into the fire, seeing ghosts in its flickering light. "Part of me wants to kill you. Part of me wants to forgive you. Part of me just wants to disappear and never think about any of this again." "And which part is winning?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words surprised him. "The part that's tired of carrying so much hate," she said. "I've been angry for so long at the soldiers who killed my people, at the settlers who stole our land, at my husband for leaving me alone, at myself for surviving when so many others didn't. I'm tired of being angry all the time. Anger can keep you alive when nothing else will." "Yes, but what kind of life is that? What's the point of surviving if you're too poisoned by rage to find any joy in it?" Caleb studied her face in the firelight, seeing something he hadn't expected, not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of weary wisdom that came from carrying too much pain for too long. "My wife used to say that holding on to anger was like swallowing poison and expecting your enemy to die," he said. "I never understood what she meant until after she was gone. And now I understand that some kinds of death aren't worth the satisfaction of revenge." They sat in companionable silence after that, at each wrestling with their own demons. The revelation of Caleb's past had changed everything between them, but perhaps not in the way either had expected. Instead of driving them apart, it had forced them to confront the deeper questions of guilt, forgiveness, and what it meant to build something good from the wreckage of past mistakes. "I can't love you," Nantan said suddenly, the words falling into the darkness like stones into deep water. Caleb felt something twist inside his chest, not surprise exactly, but a kind of inevitable disappointment. "I know," he said quietly, "but I can't hate you either. And I don't know what that leaves us." Maybe it leaves us with a chance to figure out who we are without the hate, he suggested. Maybe we can be something different than what we've been, not lovers, not enemies, but two people trying to find some measure of peace in a world that seems determined to destroy it. Nantan looked at him across the fire, seeing not the scout who'd guided death to her people, but the broken man who'd risked everything to save her life. It wasn't love, and it might never be. But it was something, a possibility, a beginning, a choice to reach for light instead of drowning in darkness. Partners, she said finally. Allies in survival, if nothing else. Partners, he agreed. It wasn't the ending either of them had imagined, but it was honest. And in a world built on lies and violence, honesty felt like its own kind of miracle. They traveled for 3 weeks through country that tested every survival skill they possessed. The Badlands were harsh and unforgiving, with little water and less shelter. But they offered one crucial advantage: they were nearly impossible to track through, especially for a posse of townspeople unused to the challenges of wilderness pursuit. Gradually, they worked their way south toward the Mexican border, following ancient game trails and trading paths that predated the arrival of white settlers. Nantan's knowledge of the country proved invaluable, while Caleb's practical skills kept them fed and equipped for the journey. Slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild something that might have been called trust. Not the easy companionship they'd shared at the ranch, but something harder and more durable, a partnership forged in shared hardship and mutual need. They didn't speak of love or forgiveness. Those wounds were too fresh, too complicated to be resolved with words. Instead, they focused on the immediate challenges of survival, finding in their daily struggles a kind of rhythm that felt almost natural. There's a town ahead, Caleb said one morning as they crested a ridge overlooking a small valley. Esperanza. It's right on the border, mostly Mexican, but with enough Americans that we won't stand out too much. Can we trust them? We can trust them to mind their own business if we pay for what we need and don't cause trouble. Esperanza was exactly what he'd promised, a dusty border town where questions weren't asked and past sins could be buried beneath new identities. They found lodging at a small boarding house run by a Mexican woman who accepted their story about being travelers heading south without demanding details. For the first time in weeks, they had real beds, hot food, and the luxury of feeling relatively safe. But safety brought its own problems. Without the immediate demands of survival to focus on, they were forced to confront the question of what came next. We can't run forever, Nantan said, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sun set over the desert. Eventually, we'll have to decide what we're running toward instead of what we're running from. Any ideas? She was quiet for a moment, considering possibilities that had been unthinkable just weeks earlier. There are Apache communities in Mexico, she said finally. Refugees from the wars who've built new lives across the border. I could find them, try to start over. And me? You could come with me if you wanted, or you could go your own way. The choice would be yours. Caleb studied her profile in the fading light, noting the way she'd grown stronger over their weeks of travel. The haunted look was gone, replaced by something that might have been called determination. What would I do in a Mexican Apache community? He asked. I'm not exactly welcome among your people, and I don't speak Spanish. You could learn. And not all Apache distrust whites, especially not those who've proven themselves willing to sacrifice for our welfare. It was an offer of sorts, though neither of them pretended it was motivated by romantic feelings. It was practical, pragmatic, based on mutual benefit rather than passion. I'll think about it, Caleb said. That night, as he lay in his narrow boarding house bed, he found himself truly considering the possibility, for the first time, a new life in a new country where his past couldn't follow and his mistakes might be buried beneath different sins and different hopes. It was tempting. But it was also another kind of running, and he'd grown tired of running from himself. The answer came to him in the form of a newspaper left behind by another traveler. The headline made his blood run cold. Apache massacre in Arizona territorial governor demands action. The story that followed was worse than he'd feared. A group of Apache refugees, mostly women and children, had been cornered by territorial militia near the town of Wilcox. The militia, led by Deputy Virgil Slade, had opened fire without warning. 23 Apache were dead, including 11 children under the age of 12. Caleb's hands shook as he read the account. Slade had used the burning of the Ransom ranch as justification for organizing a larger campaign against Apache refugees throughout the territory. The massacre at Wilcox was being hailed as a necessary action against hostile raiders. 23 people, Nantan said quietly. She was standing in his doorway, having read the story over his shoulder. 23 more dead because we escaped. This isn't our fault, Caleb said, though his voice lacked conviction. Slade would have found another excuse. Would he, or did our escape give him exactly the proof he needed that Apache were still a threat? Nantan's voice was flat, emotionless. Those children died because he needed to prove he was right about us. The weight of that possibility settled between them like a stone. They'd survived, but their survival had cost other lives. The mathematics of guilt were never simple, but the burden felt undeniable. What do you want to do? Caleb asked. Nantan stared out the window at the desert night, her face a mask of grief and rage. I want to go back, she said. I want to stop running and face what we've caused. And that's suicide. Slade will kill us both the moment we cross the border. Maybe. Or maybe there are still good people in that territory who listen to the truth. Oh, what truth? That you're not a raider, that I'm not harboring enemies of the state who's going to believe us now. Nantan turned to face him, and he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a cold determination that spoke of decisions made and prices accepted. Then we make them believe, she said simply. We find proof that Slade murdered innocent people, and we make sure the right people see it. How? I don't know yet. But I know we can't build a life on the graves of those children. If we don't try to stop him, who will? Caleb looked at the newspaper again, at the names of the dead carefully listed in small print at the bottom of the story. Among them was a name that made his heart stop: Joseph Crowfeather, age 67, described as a known Apache militant. He remembered the old man who had blessed their journey, who had spoken of bridges instead of walls. Joseph Crowfeather had been at Wilcox with his grandson David, probably trying to negotiate safe passage for the refugees. Now he was dead, another casualty of Slade's campaign of hatred. You're right, Caleb said quietly. We can't run from this. Even knowing it might mean our deaths, especially knowing that. Some things are worth dying for, and stopping Slade is one of them. They left Esperanza the next morning, heading north toward a confrontation that would either vindicate them or destroy them. Neither spoke much during the journey. They were too focused on the task ahead, too aware of the odds they faced. But as they rode, Caleb found himself thinking about something Nantan had said weeks earlier, that anger could keep you alive, but it wasn't much of a life. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe it was time to choose hope over despair, justice over revenge, truth over the comfortable lies that let evil flourish in darkness. Maybe it was time to stop being the man he'd been and become the man he should have been all along. They reached the territorial capital 3 days before the legislative hearing on the Wilcox massacre. News of their arrival spread quickly through the small community of politicians, journalists, and territorial officials who controlled the fate of the Arizona territory. Some saw them as dangerous fugitives who should be arrested on sight. Others viewed them as potential witnesses whose testimony might complicate the official narrative of Slade's heroic campaign against Apache raiders. Judge Hoffman, the same man who had presided over the earlier hearing in Dry Creek, agreed to meet with them privately. He was older now, more weathered by the political pressures of his position, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that made him a formidable advocate for justice. Now, this is highly irregular, he said as they sat in his private chambers. "You're both wanted for questioning in connection with several serious crimes." "What crimes?" Nantan asked. "Are harboring fugitives, theft of livestock, destruction of property, conspiracy to commit violence against territorial citizens." Hoffman ticked off the charges on his fingers. "Deputy Slade has been quite thorough in documenting your alleged offenses." "All lies," Caleb said flatly. "Perhaps, but lies backed by sworn testimony from respected members of the community carry significant weight in a court of law." "What about the truth?" Nantan demanded. "What about the 23 people murdered at Wilcox?" According to the official report, those were hostile combatants killed while resisting lawful authority. Joseph Crow Feather was 67 years old. She said, her voice tight with controlled fury. He was a grandfather, trying to negotiate safe passage for women and children. What kind of hostile combatant was he? Judge Hoffman's expression softened slightly. "I knew Joseph. He was a good man trying to find peaceful solutions to impossible problems." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But what I know personally and what I can prove in a court of law are two different things." "Then help us prove it," Caleb said. "Give us a chance to present evidence to tell our side of the story." "Now what evidence?" "What story you were both fugitives when the massacre occurred. You have no witnesses, no documentation, no proof beyond your own testimony, which frankly will be viewed with considerable skepticism." Hoffman was right, and they all knew it. In the court of public opinion, they were already guilty. Slade had crafted his narrative, carefully painting them as dangerous criminals whose escape had necessitated strong action against all Apache in the territory. "There has to be something," Nantan said desperately. "Some way to expose the truth about what really happened." "There might be," said a new voice from the doorway. They turned to see a young man in his 20s, well-dressed, but with the weathered hands of someone accustomed to hard work. His features were Apache, but his clothes and bearing spoke of education and assimilation into white society. "David Crow Feather," he said, introducing himself. "Joseph was my grandfather." Caleb remembered the name Joseph had mentioned his grandson during their brief meeting at Dry Creek. David worked as a translator for the territorial government, one of the few Apache who had managed to find a place in the white world without completely abandoning his heritage. "I'm sorry for your loss," Nantan said quietly. "Thank you. But I'm not here for condolences. I'm here because I have information that might help your cause." Judge Hoffman leaned forward, interested despite himself. "What kind of information?" "The kind that could expose Deputy Slade for what he really is, a murderer who's been using his badge to settle personal vendettas and advance his political career." David pulled out a leather portfolio and spread several documents on Hoffman's desk. Telegram supply orders, witness statements, all documenting a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond legitimate law enforcement. Caleb studied the papers, noting official seals and signatures that spoke of government authenticity. "Where did you get these?" "I work for the Territorial Administration. Remember, I have access to communications and records that most people never see." David's smile was grim. "Including evidence that Slade has been systematically falsifying reports about Apache activity in order to justify increasingly aggressive military action." "This is explosive," Judge Hoffman murmured, reading through the documents. "If this information is accurate, it proves that Slade has been deliberately provoking conflicts for his own benefit." "It's accurate," David assured him. "The question is whether you're willing to use it." Hoffman looked up at the three people standing before his desk, a disgraced rancher, an Apache fugitive, and a young man whose own position in the territorial government was precarious at best. They were asking him to risk his career, his reputation, perhaps even his life, to expose a conspiracy that reached deep into the political structure of the territory. "You realize what you're asking?" he said carefully. "Slade has powerful allies. If we move against him and fail, we'll all pay the price. And if we don't move against him at all, Nantan asked, how many more innocent people will die while we worry about our own safety? It was the central moral question, and they all knew it. In the end, justice wasn't about legal technicalities or political calculations. It was about choosing right over wrong, even when the choice came with terrible costs. All right, Hoffman said quietly. I'll convene a special hearing to examine these allegations. But you understand that this is likely to get very dangerous very quickly. We understand, Caleb said. Well, it's good, because once we start down this path, there's no turning back. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving them 3 days to prepare their case and brace for Slade's inevitable counterattack. They spent the time gathering additional witnesses, documenting their own experiences, and trying to anticipate the deputy's likely strategies. Slade predictably didn't wait for the formal proceedings to begin his defense. By Saturday morning, posters had appeared throughout the territorial capital describing Caleb and Nantan as dangerous fugitives with substantial bounties on their heads. By evening, a crowd of armed men had gathered outside the boarding house where they were staying, demanding their immediate surrender. This is what he does, David explained as they watched the crowd from an upstairs window. He turns every legal proceeding into a mob action, every question of justice into a test of public loyalty. How do we counter it? Caleb asked. We don't. We let him overplay his hand and hope that decent people recognize the difference between justice and lynching. It was a thin hope, but it was all they had. Through the weekend, the tension in the capital continued to build. Supporters of Slade's aggressive policies rallied to his defense, while a smaller group of citizens began to question whether the deputy's methods were compatible with civilized governance. The hearing itself began Monday morning in an atmosphere that felt more like a trial than an administrative proceeding. Judge Hoffman presided with grim determination, flanked by territorial officials who clearly wished they were anywhere else. Slade entered the hearing room like a conquering hero surrounded by supporters and radiating the confidence of a man who'd never faced serious opposition. He was tall, thin, with pale eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness in his opponent's defenses. Your Honor. He began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to public speaking. I'm here to answer false charges brought by known criminals and their sympathizers. The people of this territory deserve better than to see their elected officials entertaining the fantasies of Apache raiders and their white accomplices. It was a strong opening calculated to frame the entire proceeding as an attack on legitimate authority by dangerous subversives. Several of the territorial officials nodded approvingly, clearly prepared to support Slade's position. But Judge Hoffman wasn't easily intimidated. That Deputy Slade, he said calmly, you're here to answer questions about your conduct in office, not to lecture us about territorial policy. Please confine your remarks to the specific allegations under review. The first phase of the hearing focused on the events at Dry Creek and the burning of Caleb's ranch. Slade presented his case with professional polish, describing a coordinated campaign by Apache raiders to steal livestock and terrorize settlers. In his telling, the attack on the ranch had been a defensive action against confirmed hostiles. Mr. Ransom was harboring known Apache militants, he testified. When we attempted to serve legal warrants, they opened fire on duly appointed law enforcement officers. We had no choice but to respond with appropriate force. What warrants? Judge Hoffman asked. Slade produced several official-looking documents, all properly signed and dated. Warrants for the arrest of Apache raiders responsible for livestock theft and assault on territorial citizens. Caleb studied the warrants from across the room, noting discrepancies in the dates and signatures. But challenging them would require expert analysis that they didn't have time to arrange. The second phase focused on the massacre at Wilcox. Here, Slade's narrative became more complex, involving Apache raiders who had been using women and children as human shields while conducting military operations against settlers. It was a tragedy, he said with apparent sincerity. But when hostile combatants use civilians to protect their military operations, civilian casualties become inevitable. We did everything we could to minimize harm to non-combatants, including 11 children under the age of 12. Nantan asked from her seat at the defense table. I don't take questions from wanted criminals, Slade replied coldly. You'll take questions from me, Judge Hoffman said firmly. Deputy Slade, please explain how children aged 5 to 12 posed a military threat requiring lethal force. The children were not targeted specifically. They were casualties of combat operations against their adult relatives who were using them as protection. It was a plausible explanation delivered with bureaucratic precision. Without witnesses to contradict his version of events, Slade's testimony carried the weight of official authority. But then David Crow Feather took the stand. My grandfather was at Wilcox as a peace negotiator. He testified, his voice steady, despite the obvious emotion behind his words. He had been in communication with territorial officials for weeks, trying to arrange safe passage for Apache families who wanted to relocate to Mexico. Can you prove that? One of the territorial officials asked. David produced copies of telegrams and official correspondence, all documenting Joseph Crow Feather's attempts to negotiate peaceful solutions to the refugee crisis. These communications show that my grandfather was operating with the knowledge and tacit approval of territorial authorities, he said. He was not a militant or a raider. He was an old man trying to prevent exactly the kind of violence that occurred at Wilcox. The documents were damning clearly contradicting Slade's characterization of the victims as hostile combatants. But the deputy was ready with a counterattack. Your Honor, he said, standing to address the court, I question the authenticity of these documents. Mr. Crow Feather has clear motives to fabricate evidence against the territorial officials who were responsible for his grandfather's death. The documents are authentic, Judge Hoffman said after examining the official seals and signatures. The question is how to interpret them. There's no interpretation needed, Nantan said, rising from her seat despite the judge's earlier ruling about testimony from wanted fugitives. 23 innocent people are dead because this man needed to justify his personal vendetta against Apache refugees. Remove her from the courtroom, Slade demanded. I think not, Judge Hoffman replied. Miss Nantan, you're not officially a witness in this proceeding, but I'm willing to hear your testimony if you're prepared to answer questions under oath. It was a risky decision that could backfire spectacularly, but Nantan nodded her acceptance. She'd come too far to back down now. Her testimony was compelling and detailed, describing not just the events at Dry Creek, but the broader pattern of harassment and intimidation that had preceded the violence. She spoke of the cattle killed for no reason, the supplies stolen, the escalating threats designed to provoke exactly the kind of confrontation that would justify Slade's extreme response. Deputy Slade wasn't trying to arrest dangerous criminals, she concluded. He was trying to create dangerous criminals, to manufacture the threat he needed to advance his political career. The hearing room was silent when she finished. Even Slade's supporters seemed shaken by her composed, detailed account of systematic persecution. But the deputy had one more card to play. The story. Your Honor, he said, producing a final document from his briefcase. I have here a sworn statement from a reliable source confirming that both Mr. Ransom and Miss Nantan were involved in planning raids against territorial settlers. This witness is prepared to testify under oath about their criminal conspiracy. Judge Hoffman examined the document with growing concern. If authentic, it would undermine everything they'd established during the hearing. Who is this witness? He asked. Someone whose identity must be protected for security reasons, Slade replied. But I can arrange for closed testimony if the court requires it. It was a masterstroke of legal maneuvering, introducing evidence that couldn't be effectively challenged because its source remained hidden. Caleb could see the territorial officials beginning to waver, their earlier sympathy replaced by uncertainty. The hearing was slipping away from them, and there seemed to be nothing they could do to stop it. That's when the unexpected happened. The courtroom doors burst open, and Pete Morrison strode in, followed by Doc Harris and Father Mackenzie from Dry Creek. All three men looked like they'd been riding hard for days, their clothes dusty and their faces grim with purpose. "Your Honor," Pete announced, "we request permission to present additional testimony relevant to these proceedings." Judge Hoffman looked surprised but interested. "Mr. Morrison, this is highly irregular. What brings you to the territorial capital?" "The truth," Pete replied simply. "We came to tell the truth about what really happened in Dry Creek." Slade's face had gone pale. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't the arrival of witnesses from his own jurisdiction who might contradict his carefully constructed narrative. "I object to this irregular procedure," he said quickly. "These men have no standing in this hearing." "Or on the contrary," Judge Hoffman replied, "they appear to be material witnesses to events under discussion. I'll hear their testimony." Pete took the stand first, his weathered face serious as he described the escalating campaign of harassment against Caleb's ranch. His account matched Nantan's in every detail, confirming the pattern of provocation that had preceded the violence. Deputy Slade was looking for an excuse to move against Mr. Ransom. He testified. He made no secret of his personal animosity or his intention to use any available pretext to destroy his reputation. Doc Harris followed with testimony about treating Nantan's injuries that proved she'd been shot by Slade's men before any violence began at the ranch. The wound patterns were consistent with someone who'd been fired upon while fleeing, he testified. This was not combat between equal combatants, it was attempted murder. But it was Father Mackenzie's testimony that delivered the decisive blow to Slade's defense. "I have here," the elderly priest said, producing a letter from his coat pocket, "a confession written by Billy Morrison before his death last month. In it, he admits to lying about seeing Apache raiders near Dry Creek, lies that were used to justify the attacks on Mr. Ransom's property." The letter was devastating. In it, Billy described how Slade had pressured him to provide false testimony about Apache activity, offering money and protection in exchange for statements that would support the deputy's aggressive policies. Billy was dying of consumption, Father Mackenzie explained. He wanted to clear his conscience before meeting his maker. This confession details a systematic campaign of perjury and false evidence orchestrated by Deputy Slade. The hearing room erupted in chaos. Slade's supporters began shouting accusations of forgery and conspiracy, while his opponents demanded immediate action based on the new evidence. Judge Hoffman gavelled for order, but it took several minutes to restore enough quiet for proceedings to continue. Deputy Slade, the judge said when order was finally restored, "You're faced with serious accusations supported by credible evidence. How do you respond?" Slade looked around the courtroom, seeing his support crumbling and his carefully constructed narrative falling apart. He was trapped exposed, facing the collapse of everything he'd worked to build. "This is a conspiracy," he said desperately. "A coordinated attack by Apache sympathizers and territorial enemies who want to undermine legitimate authority." Or, Judge Hoffman said quietly, "It's the truth finally coming to light." The judge called for a brief recess to consider the evidence, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. When proceedings resumed, he delivered a verdict that would reshape territorial policy toward Apache refugees. Based on the evidence presented, he announced, "I find that Deputy Virgil Slade has systematically abused his authority, fabricated evidence, and committed acts of murder under color of law. I hereby order his immediate arrest and recommend that territorial authorities launch a full investigation into all operations conducted under his supervision." The courtroom erupted again. But this time, the chaos was different. the sound of justice finally being served, of truth finally overcoming lies. Slade was arrested on the spot, though his trials would continue for months. The investigation that followed would uncover a network of corruption and abuse that reached throughout the territorial law enforcement system. But for Caleb and Nantan, the most important victory was simpler: they were free. The charges against them were dropped, their names cleared, their right to live in peace restored. They returned to Dry Creek together, though neither was quite sure what they'd find there. The town had changed in their absence, grown larger, more diverse, more tolerant of differences. The burning of Caleb's ranch had shocked many residents into questioning their own prejudices and assumptions. The land where his house had stood was still scarred by fire, but new growth was already beginning to emerge from the ashes. With help from Pete Morrison and other neighbors, they began the slow process of rebuilding not just the physical structures, but the life they wanted to create together. It wasn't the same as it had been before. Too much had happened, too many truths had been revealed, too many assumptions had been shattered. But maybe that was for the best. Maybe they needed to build something new, rather than trying to restore something that had been flawed from the beginning. Their relationship, too, was different now. The easy intimacy of their early days had been replaced by something more complex, not love exactly, but a deep understanding born of shared trials and mutual sacrifice. They were partners in the truest sense, bound together by choices made and prices paid, rather than by simple attraction or convenience. "Do you think we'll ever be happy?" Nantan asked one evening as they sat on the porch of their rebuilt home watching the sun set over the prairie. "I think we'll be content," Caleb replied. "And maybe that's better than happiness. Maybe contentment lasts longer." She considered this, thinking about the peace that had settled over their lives, like snow over the landscape, quiet, pervasive healing. "I can live with contentment," she decided. The seasons turned as they always did. Spring brought new growth. Summer brought prosperity, autumn brought harvest, and winter brought the kind of storms that had first brought them together. Through it all, they built something that was uniquely theirs, not the passionate romance of legend, but something more durable and perhaps more valuable. Other Apache families began to settle in the area, drawn by word that Dry Creek was a place where differences were tolerated and peace was possible. David Crow Feather opened a trading post that served both white and Apache customers. Father Mackenzie rebuilt his church with contributions from both communities. Slowly, carefully, they created something that had seemed impossible just years earlier, a community where people of different backgrounds could live together without hatred or fear. Caleb never forgot his role in the deaths at Whispering Springs, just as Nantan never forgot the loss of her first husband. But they learned to carry their grief without being crushed by it, to honor their dead by building something good from the ashes of their mistakes. On cold winter nights, they would sit by their fire and tell each other stories about the people they'd lost, the choices they'd made, the future they were building together. And sometimes, when the wind howled outside their windows, they would remember that first storm that had brought a dying Apache woman and a grieving rancher together in an act of mercy that had changed both their lives forever. It hadn't been love at first sight. It hadn't been a fairy tale romance. But it had been something more valuable, a choice to reach across the divide that separated their peoples, to find common ground in shared humanity, to build bridges instead of walls. And in a territory torn by violence and hatred, that choice had made all the difference. Years later, when historians wrote about the Apache Wars and the settlement of the Arizona Territory, they would note the unusual peace that had prevailed in and around Dry Creek. They would cite it as an example of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over ignorance, mercy over vengeance. But they would miss the deeper truth that peace wasn't built by grand gestures or sweeping policies, but by individual choices made by ordinary people who decided that some things were worth more than their own comfort or safety. It was built by a scarred rancher who chose to save a dying woman instead of walking away. It was built by an Apache widow who chose to forgive instead of seeking revenge. It was built by townspeople who chose truth over comfortable lies, justice over expedient silence. And it was sustained by the daily choice to see each other as human beings rather than enemies, to build something good from the wreckage of their separate tragedies, to prove that mercy was indeed the thing that separated them from the beasts. The blizzard that had brought them together was long past, but its mercy lived on in every choice they made, every hand they extended, every bridge they built across the chasms that had once seemed unbridgeable. And that perhaps was the greatest victory of all.